And this was an opportunity to have him up here in Green Bay. If you listen to Larry Mueller show on the radio, usually around the holidays or every once in a while, Bill will be on there fielding bird questions about birds in general. And he writes books. He's traveled around the world. And I can't tell you much more about him other than I know I've seen him speak, and he's a great speaker. Bill Volkert, take over.
Well, thank you very much, Pat, and thank you, everyone. Pleasure to be able to join you here today. As Pat mentioned, I've been doing the Wisconsin Public Radio show for 33 years now with Larry Mueller. I worked at Horicon Marsh as the wildlife educator and naturalist for 27 years. Had a chance to talk to literally tens of thousands of people. And it turns out this year marks 50 years that I've been watching and studying birds. And also 40 years that I've been a licensed bird bander. And I'm also hoping to resume travel again. My wife and I, of course, like so many people, put everything on hold in the last few years. And I'm not real big on bird lists. I know some people are quite competitive bird watchers. I keep track of the birds around my house. I've now seen 210 species just in my backyard. And I keep track of birds for each of my travels. Our last trip was actually to Brazil 3 years ago. And when I got back, my life list was at 3,981 species. I thought, well, this will be easy. I've gone to Nicaragua twice to lead birding tours. Each time I've seen one. So I told my wife, I said, you know, at that rate, it's going to take me 30 years before I ever hit 4,000. So it's about time we get our travels back again, get ourselves going, and try to make up for some lost time. So we're hoping maybe come winter here, we'll be doing some travel again on our own. And as a result, I'm not going to be leading any Nicaragua tour this coming February, but it'll be the following year again. So I want to share with you a little something about our understanding of bird migration. And bird migration to me is a wonderful way to be able to gauge the changing seasons. There's a lot of things in nature that we see that respond to the changing seasons, but the coming and going of birds is really a wonderful way to mark it. It happens in a very predictable succession each year, and it's just a very visible way to be able to see the changes that the birds come and go each year. Also, it's one of the most extraordinary phenomena in nature, the fact that these birds are traveling hundreds and even thousands of miles each year, back and forth, and oftentimes with unbelievable, unerring accuracy. But our understanding of bird migration is something that has really come to light only in the last couple of hundred years as a general understanding of where these birds are going. And even today, there still are a lot of unanswered questions and mysteries, though our understanding continues to evolve with not only the investigations, but new emerging technology that gives us an opportunity to look into the lives of these birds as they travel in a way that we're never capable of doing so before. You know, originally, thoughts about this changes of birds from season to season had various explanations. Back in Aristotle's time, they talked about transmutation, that birds would change from one to another, so a song sparrow might become a junco. And certainly they saw that these birds were changing. There also were ideas of hibernation. They would see the swallows feeding above the ponds and lakes in fall time and just disappear. So the idea was, well, they just dove in the water and hid in the mud with the turtles and then came back in spring. In fact, in Europe, the barnacle goose got its name that way. They thought that this 6-pound goose somehow went under the water, turned into a tiny barnacle, and emerged in spring. Because there they were, then next day they're gone, and then back again in springtime. In the early 1700s, someone came up with the first idea of actual migration. It was a French scientist, but his explanation was the birds all took off in fall time and they flew all the way to the moon. And he also realized or calculated it took them 60 days to get there. What astounds me is that we at that time had already done a circumnavigation of the world. We had some idea of geography, but we had never really had considered, at least seriously, and never had the evidence that these birds went to these distant lands and came back. It wasn't until the explorers were going down Africa and finding not only new and exotic wildlife, but birds that were common to them in Europe in summertime. So it's only been the last couple of hundred years that we've really understood this migration. And as I say, we're starting to understand even more and more detail the lives of the comings and goings of these birds. But even today, myths still continue. One of the most common one is, well, it's getting cold outside, so the birds are leaving. In a way, that's half true. It's not the cold that drives the birds out, because after all, they're well insulated. A lot of them remain here throughout that cold weather, and they're very well adapted. Besides, we use some of the most insulating material in nature for down sleeping bags and parkas. So they're wearing that. It's not the cold that really drives the migration, it's food. And with the coming of the winter season, a lot of food is no longer available. So let's take a look at those birds that actually do stick around. Cardinals are a common year-round resident because they're seed eaters. That's why they come to our feeders. And whether in nature or our own offerings that we have for them, these birds are able to find food even during the wintertime. Mourning doves, another generalist, they're able to find plenty of food and therefore have very little need to migrate. So this is a bird that we find year-round. Blue jays, just like their relatives, the crows, they're complete generalists. Anything from seeds to insects. I've even seen them taking tiny garter snakes. They'll eat acorns in fall. They'll pick on carrion. Almost anything is food for a blue jay, so there's not a big reason to leave. And their migration is really shifting out of Canada of rather short distance migrant movements among the population. And of course, they readily come to our feeders through the wintertime too for handouts. Among other seed eaters are the finches, goldfinches, with that dramatic change in their colors from bright lemon yellow to the winter colors, muted olive yellow. And their relatives, pine siskin and the common redpoll. What amazes me about the redpolls is this is a bird that nests in the Arctic. And we only see them here periodically when there's a crash of food. So you can imagine Wisconsin is certainly known for a bit of a harsh winter. These birds survive the Canadian winter with very short daylight and will remain up there even at temperatures of 20, 30, 40 below zero for a tiny bird like this if there's food. So they're incredibly well adapted to that cold weather. But it's the food that moves them like everyone else. Now, most of our birds that migrate out in the wintertime are the insect eaters. Well, woodpeckers certainly also take insects, though here red bellies will come for seed. But of course, the insects they're looking for are the dormant ones that are hiding among the bark and within the wood. And their larger relatives, the pileated, are excavating that food. So there's some of the insect eaters that are able to find their food by excavating them in the trees. Or a little nuthatcher pecking in the bark to extract that same kind of food. And then we also have some of the birds of prey that remain during the wintertime. And that's because certainly for like the Cooper's hawk, they will feed on birds and small rodents. For some of the larger hawks, they may have a difficult time as the snow gets deep, or as we see especially crashes in the cycles of the rodent population. So they oftentimes will move out in wintertime, but don't always have to. In the same way those birds are departing then before the winter comes because of food shortages, they also return again as food becomes available. And what we find is that the return of birds always happens in a very predictable sequence. And it's not to say that the same birds arrive always on the same day. It's a little bit of a myth, even with the swallows at Capistrano, they're sometimes a little early or a little late. But just like the Baltimore Oriole or hummingbird in your backyard, you can pretty well expect around May 1st, or certainly that first week of May, they're going to be back. And so they're coming back always in that same order because food becomes available for different birds at different times. So as we emerge out of winter, the first thing that happens is the snow melts. Then eventually we'll start to see the ice thaw, and slowly the ground and the trees start to warm up, and then from there the insects emerge. And so we see the different birds coming back at different times. So one of our early migrants is Canada geese. We may see them already starting to move mid-late February or sometimes into March. And that depends on the snow melt. So they're feeding in the uplands, but it's access to food. Now, working at Horicon Marsh, we certainly see an awful lot of Canada geese out there. And when I did the Christmas bird counts at the marsh, we had various kinds of counts of Canada geese in wintertime, ranging from 125,000 in years where we had no snow coming through December, to one year we had almost 2 feet of snow on the ground, and I was lucky to find 6 birds. So they can certainly tolerate the cold weather. I've seen geese standing out on the ice at 20 below. It's not that cold weather, but it's the snow depth. As that snow begins to recede, they're back almost immediately. So this is one of our early migrants, and they come back as well with other birds that feed in the uplands. Our red-winged blackbird, again feeding in those uplands, especially these days in the waste grain and the cornfields. and in some of the wild seeds that are out there in the uplands, and then slowly making their way down to the wetlands to establish their territories. Sandhill cranes also come back quite early in the year, feeding the uplands, and then slowly move to their territories in the wetlands to begin nesting. Among our ducks, they need to feed in the water, so where the geese come back early as the snow melts in the uplands, most of the waterfowl have to wait much longer before the wetlands and the lakes begin to open up. We will see some ducks that will remain around areas either of where there's freshwater springs, where the rivers may be flowing, or along the Lake Michigan shore, where the water may remain open through the winter time, but certainly most of them will vacate Wisconsin and return as that ice begins to thaw. So if the rivers begin to open first, then the wetlands thaw, and eventually the lakes, and then the diving ducks will show up. And here we see a little bit of a mixed flock: canvasback, redhead, a number of coots, and even a horned grebe in there, and a lesser scaup. Loons are another one that come back almost as fast as that ice opens up. I've already seen loons sitting on a lake where the water is only 1/3 open, and yet there's one loon already out there. I've also had years where I've watched loons in early spring with all the lakes in my area still frozen, and a bird will be flying around, make a big loop and out, and I think he's just surveying to see if there's anything open, trying to advance as fast as they can as that ice begins to recede from south to north. And of course, wood duck's another one of the many waterfowl that return with that receding of the ice. Now, I hear from a lot of people the first sign of spring is the robin, but as far as I'm concerned, and a lot of other birds are already back for several weeks before the first robin ever shows up. Because for robins, it's the frost that has to come out of the ground so that they can access for the insect larvae and for the worms that they're looking for in the uplands. So for me, it's not really a true harbinger of spring. I think the red-winged blackbird is much more so as the first sign. They're a little bit of a latecomer. And they, of course, show up with what you're all familiar with, bluebirds. Both robins and bluebirds will winter in Wisconsin, especially years where there's a good berry crop. So for the Christmas bird counts, especially around the southern part of Wisconsin, somebody somewhere will usually find a few robins or even bluebirds lingering, though the vast majority of the flock are migratory. And I think there's a little bit of a trade-off. Do you fatten up and just hold on to that energy and try to get through a couple of tough days and survive the winter here? Or do you use that energy and fly 1,000 miles to get all the way down to Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas? Which one's going to work? Or you just wait till the very latest that you can, and if you have to, depart then. And of course, with the frost coming out of the ground, it also makes available the food for probing birds like the woodcock. So these birds are coming as we get more into April, as the not only the ice and snow are gone, but now the frost start coming out of the ground. As not only is the water open, but as it begins to warm, we start to get the hatches and the emergence of insects and invertebrates in these shallow waters. So as we get into mid-late April and May, this is when the shorebirds come back. And these are some of the most extraordinary migrants as far as a family of birds. It's well noted that the Arctic tern is among one of the most long-distance migrant birds, but as a family, I think shorebirds really outdo them all. Because it's not unusual for, on average, shorebirds to do 6, 8, 10,000 miles each way, doing that twice a year. Our spotted sandpiper, which is a common summer resident in Wisconsin, is actually a short distance migrant. This bird is just going down to Central America. So from Central America to Wisconsin for a sandpiper is really a pretty short flight. This is the whimbrel, one of the larger sandpipers. This is a bird that I photographed on the wintering ground in southern Chile, and a bird that nests above the Arctic Circle. So we're talking about a 10,000 mile flight for this guy. What we're finding is that these birds are not just making these incredibly long migrations each year, but along the way, they also are much more predictable as where they're stopping over. And with radio collaring and tagging of some of these large birds, gives us an insight into their migration. Here's a whimbrel that was actually collared and tagged along the East Coast. And so if you follow where the yellow begins, this is where they first caught the bird. This is in a little estuary wetland, coastal wetland of Virginia. The bird flew north, and I got a feeling that that little loop was because the winds were carrying it a little bit out of its range. It was set to stop at the southern coast of Hudson Bay. So it flies up to Virginia, goes to southern Hudson Bay, stops there, goes straight up to the Mackenzie River Delta, on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, nests there. On its way back, take a look, it went over to Chambers Island, came down, and flew right to its wintering site in Barbados. The next year, stopped at Virginia, stopped right on Hudson Bay, and went up there. So that tells us not only are they very much homing in on the same nest site every year and the same winter site, but they're stopovers. They know exactly where they're going to stop. Which also means, what if we have an oil spill in Virginia coast? What happens to that bird? Now he's got to search around, find a new place to rest, refuel, wasting more energy. And of course, that energy is not just to get it all the way up to the nesting ground, but they have built up enough reserves for egg production for that nesting season. So these birds are very much reliant on, as we're starting to understand now, probably some of these sandpipers are kind of hopping from site to site along these thousands of miles and know exactly where they're stopping over for food resources and resting. Another bird of that sandpiper plover family that's got a well-known migration is the American golden plover. Some people refer to it not as a sandpiper, and it actually isn't, it's a plover, but they refer to them generically as grasspipers, because they're actually more in the lowland grass fields than they are, say, in the mudflats. And this is a bird that winters in the Argentine pampas and will nest above the Arctic Circle from southern Hudson Bay all the way up into the high Arctic. The picture of the bird that you're seeing on the right-hand side is an individual I photographed on a nesting ground 500 miles above the Arctic Circle on northern Baffin Island. Here's another bird. I was sitting right by its nest, and I was getting a little agitated because the nest is just off the side of the picture. This is on Hudson Bay coast, and this was actually at the far southern edge of its nesting range. One of its neighbors, this is the little semi-palmated sandpiper. It is getting ready to settle on its nest, a bird that just flew up all the way from northern and central coastal areas of South America to get up to the Arctic. And here is one of the most extraordinary birds that has been recently studied. This is a relative of our North American Hudsonian godwit. This is called the bar-tailed godwit. This is a bird I photographed along the coastal area of northern Australia. It is already starting to move north. They winter in New Zealand. The bar-tailed godwit is a bird whose population has declined by 50% over the last 15 years or so. And so scientists were concerned as to what was the cause. Why were these birds suffering? Since they're nesting way up in the Arctic, they winter around the coastal areas of New Zealand, and it didn't seem to be a big change to some of that habitat that could be affecting either nesting success or overwinter survival. The other mystery was that the birds are only seen in migration to make a stop at a few places, and only in springtime, along the coast of China by the Yellow Sea, around Japan and Korea, and then going up to the nesting ground, which is where Alaska and Kamchatka are pretty much meeting, so on both sides of the Bering Strait. So to study more about these birds, they put radio collars on them and trying to figure out what's going on with them and why don't we ever see them in the fall migration and stop over, and what are the critical sites, especially as China and Korea are developing coastal areas as ports and resort areas and losing some of those stopover sites. Is that what's affecting these birds? What they discovered was probably one of the most extraordinary insights into bird migration that has come to light in the last decade. You see, the reason that they didn't find any birds ever see them in their fall migration and stopover is because we discovered they don't. These birds will literally make a nonstop flight from Alaska, covering the entire length of the Pacific Ocean, a distance of 7,800 miles nonstop, flying 8 to 9 days without ever coming down. They can't swim. The next mystery now is, how do they even do that? We have some information showing that they actually will shrink the size of their liver, their kidneys, and other internal organs just to make room for fuel. But how do you survive? How does the bird even maintain its metabolism and to be able to fly for 9 to 10 days nonstop, day and night? And they all do it.
So how many days back up?
On the way up, it's going to take probably about a month's time. So they're waiting for things to warm up in the Arctic. So they're flying from New Zealand right here. This is stopover. That's where I photographed them, actually right up here. along that northern coast of Australia. They'll make a stop over by Korea, Japan, western coast of, or eastern coast of China, move up to Kamchatka area, and then nest in far eastern Siberia and into western Alaska. But you see, these birds are moving, again, that hopscotch type of flight, and they need to not only have that fuel to get there, but they will arrive on the Arctic, and this is true of most Arctic breeders, they arrive before food is actually available. So in other words, they're carrying that load with them for egg production. And this is really true of most birds. The idea is not to arrive on the breeding grounds when the food is most available. The real goal is to have the young hatch out when the food becomes available. So again, for Canada geese, we've studied this at Horicon Marsh. We found that egg production in Canada is directly related to the quantity and quality of food available in east central Wisconsin. So with that, they'll actually carry that load, get up there, and when they arrive on the breeding grounds around Hudson Bay, there's still snow covering the ground. They will sit and wait and until that snow melts to begin to set up a nest. So the other thing that affects egg production for Canada geese in the subarctic is how long does that spring thaw take? The longer the female has to wait for the snow to melt to find a nest site, the more she burns up her energy and has less available for egg production. So they're literally carrying the load with them. Same thing's true, by the way, of red knot, another sandpiper. Here's a bird that flies from Brazil and Argentine coast, goes straight up across the ocean, stops at Delaware Bay on the east coast, loads up there, comes the very same week the horseshoe crabs come in to spawn, which happens only right around the full moon of springtime. They come there, load up, and they will carry that extra load and use that for not only to get to the Arctic, but for egg production. Yeah, question?
But then aren't there like storms at sea that throw them about, or are they flying above?
We don't know what they're doing out there. We have no clue. I mean, all we know is they're just going from point A to B, and all we're able to do is from the GPS coordinates to figure out where they're going. What's going on, we're not able to track them that closely yet. Who knows what technology may be able to give us some insights. So the technology has given us a chance to be able to look into the lives of these birds in a way as never before. And of course, that's going so quickly. Who knows what we'll be developing next. You see, up until recently, the GPS was only something that we could use to track very large birds because the equipment was so heavy. We're now getting down little nano tags we can put on even monarch butterflies and hummingbirds. It works in a different way than a GPS, but we can track them. So who knows what's coming? Well, I think for people who watch birds in Wisconsin, the real highlight comes in springtime as we get into that last week of April, and especially the first 2-3 weeks of May, with the songbirds that come back. Our rose-breasted grosbeak, black and white warbler, blackburnian, the golden wing warbler. We've got here the magnolia, Cape May, common yellowthroat, and even our hummingbirds. These are all birds that are going down to the tropics. Our yellow warbler, anywhere from Central America to Northern South America. Catbirds into Mexico, South America. Canada warbler going all the way down into Peru. And then the short distance migrants, even our rufous-sided or eastern towhee, wintering in the southern U.S. and Mexico. But the vast majority of those songbirds are referred to as neotropical migrants or New World tropical migrants. These are birds that are spending their winter in Central and South America. And this are the travels, even for these tiny songbirds, to be making these trips of about 2.5, maybe even 3,000 miles each way. One of the misunderstandings is that people are certainly, and rightfully I always have to say, concerned about the loss of the Amazon rainforest, but for Wisconsin and North America, most of our birds don't go there. Baltimore Orioles, certainly a favorite. Always that first week of May, we see them come back, a bird that's traveling between here and Central America, just like the rose-breasted grosbeak. And as I mentioned earlier this year, I had taken some groups again to Nicaragua for bird watching, and we were able to show people just hundreds of exotic birds, but sure enough, we had both flocks of Baltimore Orioles and rose-breasted grosbeaks down there. Kind of nice to be able to see them, how they're spending their winter. Indigo bunting, another bird that's moving between here and that same area. And scarlet tanager, longer distance migrant all the way down to Peru. In fact, as a little bit of a side, I was in Peru a few years ago, and I was with an extraordinary bird watcher. This guy just showed me all kinds of things I'd never seen before. He was keeping a property list for the area, and he was over, I don't know, 350, 400 species. And I was able to add one to his list, which was scarlet tanager. He's like, really? Are you sure? I said, look, I do know that bird. All this other stuff, you know, I'm relying on you for. He goes, oh, good, good. I thought this might be. This is from a survey that was done looking at 50 priority species of conservation concern, and birds that have shown some declines in their population, not necessarily threatened and endangered, but certainly birds that we are concerned about, and taking a look where they spend their winter. So for birds that breed in Wisconsin, some of the more critical ones that we're monitoring, we can see that some of them are just moving over to the southeastern and southern United States. Bluebirds, eastern towhees, or tree swallows, they're just barely getting into Mexico as the southern part of their range. A lot of our sparrows are just heading down to the southern U.S. So we certainly have to concern ourselves for both the breeding grounds in northern part of the U.S. and maintaining wintering sites in the southern U.S. Others, however, as we get into the southern part of Mexico, into Central America, and into southeastern part of South America, or southwestern part of South America, the far western Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and northern Peru, those are the real hot spots right in there. And of course, if you take a look at it, it's also a very small geographic area compared to all the US and Canada. So we're concentrating all those birds in a small area. And that's why deforestation in the tropics is such a concern. That 1 acre down there is probably having the impact of several hundred acres of land changes up here. I like this picture. You know, we're responsible for providing for birds here because this is the only place they nest. They go down to the tropics to escape the winter and the shortages of food, but they don't nest there. So we've got them nesting here. We've got to take good care of them. Well, I like this, move to the country, got wildlife lane. Wouldn't that be nice to have all these animals around you? Where are they gonna hide? There is zero habitat there, and this is the unfortunate thing. So, yeah, wishful thinking, but yeah, somebody's gonna have to do some serious landscaping here if they want to see wildlife. So it's really the habitat that's going to maintain these birds' breeding grounds and the quality of that and the sufficient food for them, both as a secure nesting site and to be able to rear their young and feed them so that they can successfully make that preparation for the fall migration. I've been banding birds, as I said, for 40 years now. This is a male and female yellow warblers that are captured. Common breeder here in Wisconsin, and also a very common bird in central and northern part of South America. So a very broad range where we'll see them wintering. So some of these birds are found all across the eastern U.S. where they're nesting, and also across a fairly good range of central and even northern South America for some of them as a wintering range. Others are much more specific and homing in on a smaller range, and it varies from bird to bird, from species to species. Common yellowthroat, another bird that's heading down to Central America. And here's our little American redstart, and you see the little lake band. So it's always nice with the bird banding that we can be able to sample these birds. This was the old way, and it still is an important tool that we use for monitoring birds, though the electronics for specialized studies is adding to that, but you see the little lake band, the number tag. And for me, it's also not only enjoyable as getting an insight into the birds, but always nice to be able to see them up close like this, study them, and get a nice photograph. Northern water thrush, our ovenbird.
They're disappearing, aren't they?
Ovenbirds?
I'm not hearing the oven.
No, I'm not hearing them the way I used to either, not the same density, definitely not. Oh, this is our yellow-throated vireo. And one of my favorites, the magnolia warbler, spectacular bird. And even the orange-crowned warbler, which we normally don't see the orange crown of. Very secretive one. This is our mourning warbler. Blackburnian, always one everybody's favorite. This is a first-year bird, so it's not the most striking color, though not bad for somebody who's going to get even more intense the next year. Golden wing warbler, bird that's been declining. And by the way, with a lot of these warblers, we do have a 2-year plumage. So the first year is not always that brilliant and fully developed. And we can see this among some of these, like the Blackburnian, even the black-throated green, or among American redstart. The first year males actually look like females. And as a little bit of a side here, I remember years ago reading some of the classic old studies on birds' behavior and vocalization. And the author there had stated that the males do almost all of the singing, but in a few species, the females will also sing. Cardinals, they'll sing. We may hear it among a few others. And then he mentioned the American redstart. And I remember making a strong mental note of that. I thought, this is really weird, because here you have this whole family of warblers, and only one out of all those warblers would the females sing. Why would that be? Yeah, it's a first-year male. They didn't understand that at that time. So this was a 1940s classic.
Oh,
It was an old book. So that also means when these birds come back the first year, they're not always successful as they can be in attracting a mate. So here's the bigger conservation concern. You've got a bird that's hopefully raised here in Wisconsin, has to travel all the way to the tropics, survive there where in a place he's never been before, come back out here, and he'll be singing and trying. He's certainly capable of breeding, but he's not well dressed yet. And so he may not be successful. He's got to make that and survive it again before he can come back and raise one family. And that's why there's pressures on birds like that. There's a little golden wing up close. If we take a look at warblers in Wisconsin, this is from the very first breeding bird atlas, we can take a look here at the surveys of where these birds are nesting. So in the very light beige color, 1 to 8 species are found all across southern and central Wisconsin. So any one of those areas you can find the common ones, our yellow warbler, the American redstart, common yellow-throat, some of those are in there. But you take a look then as we get into the Northwoods, 9 to 15, and in some of these areas, 16 to 23 species are nesting there. These are the real hot spots. Of course, right there, that's the Menominee Indian Reservation. The Nicolet, Chequamegon, those big national forests and the northern forested areas, those are really the breeding grounds for warblers in Wisconsin. And now with the completion of the second breeding bird atlas, we'll see what sort of changes have taken place in 20 years and see which birds are faring hopefully as well, maybe a few doing better, and of course we'll see who's not doing so well for that short time. Canada warbler is a bird of real concern because he's going all the way down to Peru. That's a long flight for him. This is our little indigo bunting. Cardinal. As I said, it's nice to have those birds in the hand, to be able to watch them up close, but bird banding does have its occupational hazards. That does not feel that good, and I can tell you grosbeaks are even worse. I found that the first thing I do if I see a rose-breasted grosbeak in my net, first thing I do is I get a bunch of little twigs, a little bit thicker than a toothpick. Because he's looking to grab something. I'm going to make sure it's not my fingers. Like, here, feed him. Hold on to that while I try to get you out. I usually put a few in my pocket, so he spits that out, I give him another one. Because they will leave a mark. Now, we talk about spring migration and fall migration, but it turns out if you take a look at the whole world of birds as they come and go, migration takes up most of the year. As I said, our Canada geese and red-winged blackbirds will sometimes be moving in mid-late February already in early spring. And we see the last migrants coming through as the nighthawks, the cuckoos are showing up as we get into the latter part of May. Fall migration will begin in July already. This is when the shorebirds start to come back. The shorebirds will be making this blast all the way up to the Arctic. As soon as that snow's melting, they'll be establishing a territory, looking for a mate. They'll mate, she'll lay those eggs, but then she raises the family alone, and as we get into July, some of those males, either successful or non-breeding males, or even some of the immature birds, will already be coming back to Wisconsin in July. August, we'll start to see that pick up, and right now, September, we're really getting into the peak of the songbird migration. Interesting, in springtime, it is so easy to know when these birds show up because you have not seen an oriole all year, and boom, there he is right out the window, and you can mark the exact day when that bird is back. Same with your hummingbirds and others like that. Fall migration is an interesting phenomenon because we really have more birds than we had in the spring because everything that survived from springtime is now coming back with all of their young. It's the maximum population, but yet they're much harder to find and much harder to see at this time of year than they are in springtime. Some of these birds have certainly lost the brilliant breeding plumage as we see among the warblers. And on top of that, just look out the window, the leaves are still as thick as can be. And so I refer to this as the silent procession. very quietly. These birds are not singing very much, maybe a little chip and calling. They're up in the canopy of the forest. They're not that easy to see, either because of the foliage or because of the loss of colors as well. And very quietly, literally millions of birds are working their way through overhead as they're getting ready to head south. So if you want to do a little warbler watching this time of year, it's a little more deliberate. You've got to get out there with binoculars. You've got to really spend some time and start looking up in the canopy to see what you can find up there among all the leaves. So these birds, this is where they're heading to. We saw in this graphic a little bit earlier. These long flights from Wisconsin all the way down to Central South America for the vast majority of these birds. This is a long flight for them. And we're finding that some of these birds are actually undertaking these trips in a relatively short period of time. Spring migration is much more hurried. Some of these birds are getting from southern Mexico all the way up to the breeding ground in only a week and a half. So it's a real rush to get there. On fall, they can take their time, and it may be more like a month's time, slowly wending their way down, taking advantage of food, because it's a long time before the season catches up with them. But as I said, food is really driving this, and what you're going to find is that the birds are not waiting till the last of the food, because we still got a while. Any gardener knows that we don't have to worry about a frost yet for a while, but the birds are migrating already. Because if insects is your entire diet, you can't wait to the very last day, because one good cold night could wipe out the entire food supply. So they're leaving in anticipation of that. So swallows have been gathering up for several weeks now, and they're moving out right now. Because again, they want to make sure they're long gone before all of a sudden we get a killing frost and that food disappears. So they anticipate that coming food shortage.
And less insects too, right? I mean, we spray everything.
Well, you bring up a good point here as far as the loss of the insect food. And a study came out several years ago in Europe. They've been able to document about a 60% decline in insect populations. And well, when I used to do a lot of wildlife surveys, we used to refer to both the very formal field surveys, where you'd have a protocol and a technique to do it, and then there was a casual one, which we called the windshield survey. You just drive around and you take a look and just see how things are doing. Well, for insects, we can also all probably remember good windshield surveys. 25 years ago, you drive around on a summer night, you'd have to clean off your windshield.
Yeah.
It's just not that way.
You're right.
My conclusion is this. Long time ago, we knew that there were some insects that are certainly serious pests, and we decided to declare war on them. And we've been throwing everything at the insects that we can possibly come up with. And when one doesn't work, or is banned for some reason, like DDT, we find something else. We've been throwing everything on them, and unfortunately it's working. We declared war on the insects, and we're winning. But at what cost?
Yeah.
And it's not just the pests that we're getting rid of. And unfortunately also in the public's mind, insects, just bugs. Bugs are bad. I mean, there could be mosquitoes, they could be ticks. It's a pretty small minority of what's out there. And as I say, unfortunately we are winning that war, but the cost is probably immeasurable.
I know it.
Here's a little ruby-throated hummingbird, and I'm always amazed that this little guy can actually fly all the way from here to Central America. When I was working at Horicon, I used to have people come up to me, and I don't know where this ever came from, but I heard this several times. Bill, is it true that hummingbirds will migrate on the backs of Canada geese? No. I think it's just so unbelievable that a bird that small does this flight, that he can actually do it on his own. My explanation used to be this. You know, Canada geese, ours only go to southern Illinois and western Tennessee. We do have a population off of western Hudson Bay that goes all the way to Texas. Okay, even if you were to ride him all the way to Texas, the hardest part comes after that. He's just run out of a free ride. Of course, their explanation was, well, he just saved all that energy to get there on that goose. Now he can do it on his own. No, as hard as it believed, he does it entirely on his own, no assistance. There is no free ride for him.
I would say nature is a wonderful thing, because monarch butterflies can go all the way to central Mexico from
Yes.
Wisconsin. So it's amazing. So I'm not surprised those little birds can make that.
And I think that's the one thing that we really don't yet understand is how much energy does it take to keep a butterfly aloft for how many hours to cover how many hundreds of miles, or a little hummingbird like this. I mean, what is a fat hummingbird, first of all, and how much does that fuel get them? It's certainly going to beat any vehicle I've ever driven, though, that's for sure. Here's one of my visits to Nicaragua. As I mentioned, I've been working down there for the last 20 years, and I've made now 16 trips down there, some of it for leading bird tours. I've also helped them develop a national bird conservation education plan, and was down there for a national strategy to develop protections of their endangered and threatened birds. So I had to go out with some scientists one day. They had mist nets set up in the jungle, and we were catching birds. There was all kinds of great exotic stuff. And here we got a little hummingbird. Well, in this part of Nicaragua was a chance to get about 16 different hummingbirds. So I was like, wow, this one here, it's a female. It could be a little tough. So here the scientists were looking through their field guide, trying to check it out. Here's what we came up with. It's a female ruby throat. Sure enough, there she was. Among all these other exotic hummingbirds that live year round, this little bugger made it all the way down there, and he's going to turn around and come back again, or I should say she. Here's our little Wilson's warbler. I photographed him in my backyard. He'll be going to Canada to nest. But when I get down to Nicaragua, in the northern part of the country, I go into the northern highlands. This is cloud forest, and this is actually shade-grown coffee. And everybody's heard about the benefits of shade-grown coffee. And here you see the somewhat open canopy and the coffee plants down underneath it. There you are, see the ripening beans, and usually in January, February down there at that time of year. And here's Wilson's warbler on the shade-grown coffee. They love to pick the insects out of it. Also here we're seeing Baltimore oriole and wood thrush, two common winter birds, or summer birds for us. These were both taken on the wintering ground. Baltimore oriole was taken in northern Nicaragua, the wood thrush in Costa Rica. This is where they spend their winter. One of my visits to Nicaragua, again, that same reserve in the northern highlands, a place called El Jaguar, I was invited to come along to work with some scientists from Canada. And here we were in this cloud forest. We set up mist nets in the cloud forest, and here we were capturing various birds in the area. The neat thing for me was they're also catching a lot of local resident birds, including the tawny-winged wheat creeper. This was fun to see up close. And this was a bird that you hear all the time, but to actually get a sight of it, this is tough. This is black-headed nightingale thrush. You can always hear them calling out in the forest. I was actually at this very same place 11 times before I got an actual look in the wild of a nightingale thrush. They're very secretive, so it was fun to see them up close. But the target bird they were going after was this. This is wood thrush. This bird in the hand, and here we get the calipers. We're measuring the wing, the beak. This is the length and depth of the beak, getting the various measurements of it and some basic statistics. And what they were affixing the bird with was not just a leg band, but this. This is the geolocator. And this was something that was developed in barely the last 20 years. The geolocator sits on the back of the bird. It has a little chip in it, and what it does is it registers the sunlight every day. It gets the hours of sunlight exposure and the angle of that sun. And from that, you can then download that and get the location of where that bird is. The trick is this. You've got to get down on the wintering ground where we know these birds are territorial, keep moving your nets, try to catch birds on their territories in different areas, and then you got to recapture them because you got to take that little thing and get the tag on the geolocator and download the chip. So they marked, I think it was 26 birds on this property, and they got 6 of them back, which is actually pretty good. Here's what they found. And this has also been done for a few other species now. We've got so many more blanks to fill in. Wood thrushes, like so many of our neotropical migrants, don't just go south and don't just go to Central America. Distinctive populations go to very specific regions of that area. So what we find is the birds from way up in New England are going down to Costa Rica. The ones from the Appalachians are going to Nicaragua. The ones from Mexico are going into the Midwest. And from Belize, these are birds in the southern Appalachians. We've got an interesting project in Wisconsin. This is the Natural Resources Foundation has been collecting money to buy land in the Osa Peninsula of Costa Rica. Let's save some rainforest, let's have some wintering habitat for our birds. Of course, this may tell us that we may be actually collecting money for New York's birds. That may be for one species, but for another it may be completely different. We don't know, but we are starting to find out for the few that have actually been studied that have this broad range As I said earlier, yellow warblers are known from Honduras all the way down to Colombia. These are distinctive regional populations of where they're going. That also leaves an interesting question about ovenbirds. Where are Wisconsin ovenbirds spending the winter, and are the problems from the loss of the forested larger stands in Wisconsin area for nesting ground, or is it loss of some of the habitat there? And it may not be just across the tropics if that's the case. It may be one very specific country or region even. So we have a lot of blanks to fill in, but we're starting to understand that these birds don't just go south and don't just go to the tropics, but distinctive regional populations go to very distinctive areas down there as well. And this has all just come to light just within the last 10 years. So here's our wood thrush, singing in our forest here and having a very specific area going down to Belize and Guatemala. So, as I say, our recent studies have been revealing a much greater understanding of migration. Yet there's always something that we don't completely understand about birds. There's a lot of unanswered questions. And to me, I think this is really interesting because it keeps it the mystery and wonder of migration. As much as we understand today, things that we never knew before, there's still more and more questions keep coming up. Of course, some of these we need to answer quite critically in order to protect and save these birds. Others, we just don't know yet completely what they do and how they do it. But it's certainly a wonderful, fascinating study. It is one of the most interesting phenomena in nature. And as I said, with new technology, we're starting to look into bird life and travels in a way that's never before, and who knows what's yet to come. And so conservation efforts need to take place throughout the whole range of these birds. We are the ones responsible for protecting the nesting grounds so that they have a secure place to raise the family. Our neighbors down in Central and South America have to protect enough forested area and habitat down there so these birds have a place to go to and overwinter and survive. And yet, we also have to take a look at stopover habitat. They need to have places to be able to stop and rest in between. It's kind of like having a good reservation all the way out in California and a nice secure home here. But how are you going to get there if there's nothing in between for gas, food, and lodging for you? That's what they need. And they do not respect international boundaries. So we need to have multiple partners throughout the entire hemisphere to protect these birds, especially for some of our shorebirds that are wintering all the way down as far as Tierra del Fuego and nesting above the Arctic Circle. The world of birds is really just a wonder. There's over 10,000 species of birds in the world. And I will admit my life goal, if I'm ever so lucky, I want to see half of them. Of course, that also means that half I'll never see if I ever get even that far. But wherever you go, there are birds, and I think that's what makes it so fascinating of a study. And I've told people this many times, if you enjoy birds and you make that part of your travel and your focus, you're also going to find not only discovery of new species and wonderful, colorful things to see in nature, but those birds will take you to some of those beautiful places out there too, whether it's nearby or whether it's in far-flung places. Besides that, bird watching is exciting. It's fun to do. So with that, we'll wrap up a little bit about the migration of birds, their travels. I'll be glad to take any questions. Yes, we got a few more minutes here. Yes, please.
Some birds don't appear to be migrating as much as they're waking. Can document those numbers, or?
How do you mean they're not migrating as much?
Well, they're not going. A lot of birds that we see, like bluebirds, for instance, they used to migrate more frequently. They'll be here.
Well, I think some of that has to do with milder weather. You know, if our winters aren't that severe, I don't know if birds can adapt that quickly, but certainly I think the mild weather is keeping these birds here. There's also, say, Canada geese. It's not that I used to hear this all the time. Well, it looks like there's so many now they don't want to migrate anymore. Well, that's a different subspecies. It's the giant Canada goose that remains here year-round, while the subarctic nesters are still going there, always have, and probably always will. But yeah, there's certainly changes in birds' behavior in response to changes in land use. The big challenge is that, of course, as we either see habitat alterations or loss, or even climate changes, the big problem here is that bird adaptation and changes in behavior usually are very slow, and the changes we're making to the land are very rapid, and we don't know if they can keep pace. That's the challenge.
Could you talk a little bit about some of the recent discoveries that have been made about how birds migrate, how they navigate from one place
Oh, sure.
to another?
Question was about how do birds actually navigate in migration. What we know a little bit as we're putting this together, and there's various kinds of studies, and the tough thing is that you can take a bird, expose it to different kinds of stimuli, and see if it responds. But we're not really sure if that applies to all of them then, if we study one bird, or if that's just a unique exception. So here's what we do know, is this was actually done in the mid-70s. They took a little indigo bunting, put him in a little cage, and I thought this was just a clever design. In the bottom of the cage, they had paper, like a little cone. So if he jumped up, he'd always slide down, and in the bottom they took a stamp pad, a little ink pad. So he'd jump around, get a little marching gown, a little ink on his feet, and he'd jump up. They put that cage in a planetarium, left them there overnight, and sure enough, the vast majority of his footprints were going to the south when he thought it was fall. They could even artificially rotate the stars, and he was always using that. So what they did is to get him ready for migration is they had him in the laboratory and they just started turning the lights out more and more. So they're shortening the daylight. That is actually the stimulus to get ready for migration. Remember, our longest day of the year was back in June. And right now, you already noticed it's getting dark pretty early, isn't it? The birds have noticed that, and it's that shortening of the day length that gets them ready for migration. The day they go has to do with changes in the weather. They want a good wind, a cold front. And so that's what moves them. And in navigation, they're probably using a number of things. We know some birds are very sensitive to electromagnetic fields. So they may be using that as sort of a feeling of which is north and where they should be heading to. We also know birds are using corridors, such as the Mississippi River, the Lake Michigan shore, the Atlantic Pacific Ocean, the Rocky Mountains. These are north-south geographic features. They can follow those. Of course, if they're using the stars, what happens when the clouds roll in? It's probably a series of things that these birds are doing, but what's really still a mystery is, for example, with the shorebirds. The parents will, first the males take off, then the adult females leave, and the young will take off and fly to a place they've never been before without anybody to lead them. How do they know where they're going? How do they know if they're there when you get there? It just feels right. And so we can throw this stimuli at birds from the outside, but we can't figure out what's going on in that little bird brain, how he processes that. And that will always probably be a mystery. But yeah, we're starting to get some understanding of that. By the way, what's another little aside, something I'm proud of is in the last, about 15 years, I was able to, and I documented and wrote this up, be able to describe an entirely new behavior and call of green herons. And I noticed this at home. And you watch, if anybody's got green herons near your neighborhood, the next 2 weeks, it's going to take place with the cold front coming through, and just a few minutes right at just before around sunset. And I noticed this years ago. This is about 2005, 2008. I was driving home. It was starting to get dark, and I saw green herons with this real flapping type of a posture. It was not a straight line flying. And you always have that sort of rhythm, but it was a little bit more accented. And when I pulled up to the house, I could hear this quack, quack, quack. It was a different call. It wasn't a skyo. It was a shorter quack, quack. And as they flew around in circles, all of a sudden they started rising up. More and more gathered. They did 2 or 3 circles, and then they all took off as the sun was going down and headed south and southwest. It only takes place for about 2 minutes in a single night or two with a north wind in early mid-September. Yeah.
Sometimes the first bird I hear or see in spring is a killdeer. Where do they winter and what are they eating when they come back?
Okay, killdeer is in the plover family, one of our shorebirds. They're a short distance migrant. Some will go all the way to Central America. Others just southern U.S. and Mexico. So they'll spread out in that whole area wherever they can. They're coming back about the time that frost is coming out of the ground. So it's invertebrates that they're looking for. Whether it's worms or any other sort of a worm-like critter, any nematodes, anything else. So that's a lot of the food. For a lot of our other sandpipers in that shallow sheep water, it's the bloodworm, the little chironomid midge larva. Yeah.
Do most birds molt before they migrate?
Oh, good question. Do most birds molt before they migrate? It depends. That's true of songbirds because they now have raised a family. This is the time of most abundant food as we get into late July, August. The family's done. They can now use that time and that energy. It does take energy to molt, regrow feathers so they've got a full complement of feathers before they've got to make the flight. Sandpipers is different. What they found in Europe is that some of these sandpipers may actually begin to molt and then will stop it and will fly and then pick up again. And so it's probably different for different groups and families of birds. And of course, waterfowl is completely different. They're going to go through what we call a complete molt. They're going to lose all their wing feathers and be incapable of flying for about 3 weeks. And that's where the ducks, the males, go into the eclipse plumage, look like a female, and then slowly get that color as we get into the late fall for the spring, winter pairing already and spring breeding. Yeah.
This doesn't have to do with migration, but I read somewhere by here and there, they find some hybrids. Do species interbreed once in a while?
Yeah, ducks in particular, mallards are pretty promiscuous. We've had mallards that have bred with teal, with pintails, with widgeons. They kind of get around. Other birds, it's a little more restrictive. And what happens in breeding is a couple of things. First of all, what you have is you have to have a behavioral isolation. So the colors of the birds, its posturing, its calling, that may be isolating them so that doesn't happen. Because a lot of times if they're not closely related, you end up with what we call the mule, the sterile offspring. Well, that doesn't get you anywhere. If you can't leave anything behind, it's going to keep them going. So you want to have some barriers. So you want to have at least a behavioral isolation, whether that's, again, plumage, the way they look, the way they sound, or the way they posture and behave and bob and so forth. And then what you also have is if it's distant enough genetic isolation, even if they try, they're not going to produce young. But yeah, hybrids do happen on occasion in nature, with some more than others.
Anything positive or negative about these massive solar farms that are going up?
Well, yeah, anything, you're using the massive solar farms. I think the negative part is you're using a lot of open land that could be in some sort of habitat or even crop production or something. I like the idea of solar. I think it's great. It's probably one of our best opportunities for something in the future. I guess my personal opinion would be, rather than taking, say, 500 acres and putting up panels with it, why don't we use the roofs that are already out there? Everybody's got a roof, especially these big box stores. Why don't we get them to do a whole array? You've already taken up how many acres with a large store or even a warehouse? Let's have them put them on top rather than eat up even more land somewhere else.
Along the same line, how about any ramifications of the large windmill generating electricity?
Yeah, I actually worked on the one over by Horicon, and I was in the hearings for the Public Service Commission as state expert witness for that one. It does not seem to be as bad for some birds, but certainly birds of prey that are soaring can get drawn into those. And of course, the other problem is they're doing more and more of these offshore. You got good steady winds out there. How do you study when everything that does get hit goes down to the bottom of the water? We have no way to be able to look at it. The other problem is that sometimes those studies can be really difficult to quantify. And here's what happened. This was actually a pesticide study that somebody was looking at. The idea was this. Here's the hypothesis. Okay, somebody sprays a field, we go out, we walk around, and we look for dead bodies of birds. Did it kill them or not? Well, the question was, how long does a dead bird remain out there that we can find it? Say a guy sprays 1 week and we go out there a week later, is that too late? So here's what they did, is they drove around and they picked up car kills. Just look for any roadkill bird, put it in the freezer, and then they took them and put them out in a field to see how long that carcass remains. What they found was 3/4 of them disappeared in a single night. Within 3 days, they're all gone. So here's the problem. Okay, a bird gets hit by one of those blades. These things are big enough. Now you see them, they're just going around like this. Do the calculation yourself of the blade sweep, how wide that is. Yeah, and the tip speed, almost 200 miles an hour. You get hit with that, and he doesn't just bink and fall down, he's gonna explode. So what do you have to find, and if there is anything to find, are you gonna be out there fast enough to even find anything as evidence? Is it gonna remain? Probably not. So that's a real gray field. We really can't evaluate it real well. And of course, like anything, like a business plan, it's location, location. Unfortunately, some of the best winds are also where the birds are moving. That's why they use it.
Yeah, because when you talk about a bird being able to fly, as far as it's flying, it's using the headwinds at that time of the year to gain some of it.
Yeah, right. And some of those corridors are the same places that we want to site those in. So I think it goes to show, and this was my conclusion of the wind farm that they had put up by Horicon, was there is no completely 100% clean, pure solution to our energy problem without some drawback. But we have to then weigh out which is gonna be the most benign, what's gonna work the best.
Yeah.
And where are you gonna put it, the location question.
1,000-acre cornfield or 1,000-acre.
Yeah. One more question.
We live up in Door County, and several years ago, we looked out of our window and saw painted bunting.
Oh,
And
yes.
we were thoroughly delighted to see it.
Yeah, painted bunting, the big nesting is in the southeastern United States, northern Florida, Georgia, into the Carolinas. Yeah, we've got a lot of people who are watching these days for birds, and I think the other benefit has been really the internet. Because in the past, if somebody had something weird in their backyard, unless you had a neighbor who was an avid bird watcher, who do you ask? So these things went unreported. Here people have some sort of a chance as a resource to try to look at it and find somebody out there that they don't know who can help them. And because of that, we're starting to have these discoveries of these birds. You know, for years, it used to always be astounding to me is, when I looked at the rare bird reports in Wisconsin, in my early years of bird watching, it was amazing that the rarest birds that were ever sighted in Wisconsin always showed up in the backyards of the best bird watchers. Well, yeah, it's because they're the only ones who could identify the thing, you know? Who knows what else came and went? And that was always the mystery. Now we've got this. So we're starting to find, yeah, things do get off course, things do get lost, and we do have some odd things that show up every once in a while. It just happens. Why? We still don't know that. Where birds are so almost unerring in migration, why is it that somebody gets caught up in the winds and takes off and goes hundreds of miles way beyond where he doesn't belong? Who knows what that's about? Well, I can admit this much, I'm just getting warmed up, I'm just getting started, but I'm having a lot of fun, but I know you've got a schedule, so I think my time is done. Thanks so much, everybody, it's a real pleasure.